Hi, my name is Johan. I'm a Swedish bat researcher. Nowadays, mainly working with bat conservation and bat surveys for city planning, road construction, when building wind power, etc. And during winter, when the bats hibernate, I spend my time writing books. And the last one is called The Duisternismanifest in English. The Dutch title is the one shown here. And the book, as well as my talk today, is about light pollution. What happens to plants and animals when we turn night into day using artificial lights? During my work with bats, I've spent plenty of nights at churchyards. This is because churches are often inhabited by long-eared bats. They especially like the big attics where they can hunt even indoors during bad weather. The name is fitting. They have huge ears to hear insect prey, and they can hunt silently even without echolocation. And this makes them perfect moth hunters, as moths usually hear bats and just steer away. Outside, the yards have often been the same for centuries. Lush, large trees, lots of insects. Longears are slow flyers. They hunt close to vegetation, listening for insect prey, and they appear rather late in the evenings. And their colonies, they return to the same place year after year. But recently, things started to change. The churches and the surrounding, they don't look the same anymore. From the 90s and onwards, we have seen a trend with more and more aesthetic lights, shining on church facades. My old supervisor and colleague, the late Jens Rydell, who has taken many of these photos, he counted bat colonies in Swedish churches in the 80s. He found that 2/3 of the churches had their own colony. 30 years later, we did the same thing and found that now there were only 1/3 of the churches with the bat colony. And it was all because of the lights. Dark churches were still inhabited. Light ones were not. A long-ear can live for 30 years or more, so in just one bat generation, half of the colonies have disappeared. For bats, darkness equals safety and fear of predatory birds, so they just wait for the night to appear, but, well, it never does. So this is why these bats now are considered threatened and are on the Swedish red list, perhaps the first mammal species on the red list due to light pollution. However, we should not only blame the church. We put lights on pretty much everything. Castles, monuments, even factories and storage buildings. And that is because we are day creatures. We need the light, and we like to look at and show off beautiful things. Well, and sometimes even not so beautiful things, in the name of advertising, for example. One of the things we often put lights on is old bridges. Benton's bats flying underneath these bridges. They eat insects off the water surface, and they even rest among the stones of the bridge. And they shy away when there is light. They start to take detours, and so do other bats hunting or commuting over waterways, such as pond bats flying over Dutch canals. It is shown that they always avoid the brightest spots of the water. But what about streetlights? Every now and then you can see bats hunt in the lights of streetlights, attracting insects. Often many people say that that's the only place where they have seen bats. And yes, some fast-flying, opportunistic bats patrol the darkness above the streetlights, diving into the light cone to catch insects stuck there. They can even take moths, who normally hear bats, but swish off the hearing in the light. Thus, these bats steal the prey from long-ears. But even these bats would never choose to live in bright places. Lamps, streetlights, are in fact a smorgasbord of food for bats and other insectivores. Insects navigate using far away natural lights, like the moon and the stars. So when approaching a light, and try to keep the same angle towards this instead of the moon, they of course get closer and closer in a spiral almost. And eventually they die of exhaustion or are eaten by predators. And everyone has sometimes seen this happen, how mosquitoes, caddisflies and moths are dancing around the porch light. Now imagine a slightly bigger lamp, like the spotlight on top of Luxor Hotel in Las Vegas, shining away into the night. This beam of light is actually visible 50 kilometers or more away, at least if you're in an airplane. So if your porch light attracts insects from your garden, this spotlight draws insects from the whole of Nevada. It's called the vacuum cleaner effect, pulling insects and whole ecosystems from the darker outskirts of the city towards the bright city centers. Sometimes it can have some more or less funny effects, like in 2019 when Las Vegas was swamped by migratory locusts, coming from all over Nevada desert, like biblical plague, haunting the city of gambling and sins. But as ironic as it seems, light pollution is considered a main factor behind the ongoing death of insects worldwide. The brightest cities on Earth are approximately 1200 times brighter than an untouched sky. So if you're born and raised a city kid, perhaps you have never used your night vision. But you don't need to go to Las Vegas, Hong Kong or Singapore, considered to be the most light polluted cities. Every city, at least in Europe, is rather bright. To the left, for example, a mid-sized Swedish town. In the middle you have Gothenburg, and to the right is outside a hotel in Stockholm, where I actually had a talk about the effects of light pollution. And if you move away from the city, you can see how all the light eats the night sky, shining orangey brown above. It's called sky glow, the collected lights reflected from cities, which you can see miles and miles away. In downtown London, Stockholm, Amsterdam, you can perhaps count 5 stars. In a remote mountain area, there are 5,000 visible stars in the sky, which actually makes the night sky appear rather bright. Moving even further, looking at Earth from above, it's obvious how humans are spreading. Every streetlight, every city light is visible, and it's easy to point out major cities and highly populated areas. Northern Italy, Britain and Netherlands, for example, seems like really nice places, as lots of people like to live there. And only the oceans appear black. However, 40% of all people live closer than 100 kilometers from a coastal area, and we are affecting the sea as well. Some of the first studies of light pollution were about sea turtles. They lay their eggs on beaches, and when the baby turtles hatch, they instantly look for the brightest spot. For 200 million years, the turtle instinct has told them that this is the horizon. Now, it is rather the opposite direction, towards beach hotels and cities. And the turtles crawl the very wrong direction, across streets rather than into the water. This, however, changed during the pandemics, when tourist places closed, and for the first time in years, the sea turtles were actually doing fine. Outside tropical beaches, coral reefs are struggling when the sea temperature is rising, but they also have problems breeding. Every year at a certain moon phase, all individuals from the same species spawn, and it's important that this is synchronized, and it usually takes 2 or 3 days. However, when moon phases are hidden in the sky glow, this event takes weeks instead, and the mating success is therefore declining. And the same goes for other creatures of the sea. relying on the moon to tell the time, like clownfish, polychaetes, crayfish, and so on. All living things have inner clocks, circadian rhythms, relying on light and the dark to tell the time of the day and year, affecting mating behaviors, migration, feeding, hibernation, pollination. For us, darkness means triggering of melatonin, our sleep hormone, important not just for a good night's sleep, but also for the immune system. There are studies suggesting that there is a higher risk of getting hormone-induced cancers in very light-polluted areas. The brightest natural light is, of course, the full moon, and this is what most animals are adapted to. A street light, on the other hand, is about 100 times brighter than that. And of course, animals are confused. Female glowworms, for example, never light a torch to guide the males as the night never comes. Caddisflies, navigating by polarized light, they mistake asphalt for ponds and mate in parking lots and at gas stations instead of in water. In a Swiss study, researchers compared how many flowers are pollinated in street-lit meadows compared to dark ones, and found that pollination frequency drops by around 60%. Even birds are affected, as they often migrate at night and gets confused when stars are no longer seen, flying lower, so they are caught in city lights and collide with skyscrapers. In some American cities, there are actually people employed just to pick up dead birds in the morning. And of course, plants cannot escape the lights either. This is a common sight in parks all over the world. Trees lit from underneath, trees decorated with light and spotlights shining on vegetation. It has been shown that trees standing under streetlight lose their leaves later in the autumn than does trees in the forest, making them more sensitive to the cold. And in spring, the flower buds are way too early. So, what should we do about this? First of all, we must identify light pollution as a true problem and compare it to, for example, sound pollution and the problem with plastics and toxics. And then we have to start to light differently. Light shining in all directions, for example, and unnecessary lighting on buildings and monuments are perhaps things we can live without. To get rid of sky glow and light on vegetation and water, we can lower the fittings, we can shield off the light. There are studies showing that red light mimicking sunset is less attractive to insects, but still gives us a chance to see. And of course, less intense light would be better, although few people would perhaps accept light equivalent to a full moon. But maybe the best and the easiest way to deal with all this is to use timers and motion sensors to avoid light when it's not needed. When nobody is there to see it, well, turn it off. In Stockholm, test sites with motion sensors save up to 60% in energy costs. And think about it yourself. If you're out in your garden at night, well, you can, of course, turn the lights on. But when you move indoors, turn it off. And if we do all this, perhaps we can see the Milky Way more often. Only a third of the world's population can, and way less in Europe. And also, if we're lucky, living a bit north, the northern light can be seen if we allow more darkness. And late summer evenings and early fall, we can watch bats swarm under the full moon. And thank you so much for listening. The book is available in bookstores near you. Thanks again.